Frank Gaffney is with me, Center for Security Policy. You go to securefreedom.org, also counterjihad.com, and Vice Chair in the Committee on Present Danger China, presentdangerchina.org. So, Frank, let's talk about where we are with, as it pertains to China and China's efforts to really ratchet up rhetoric continually with the United States. And you're seeing more and more Americans in mainstream American life to suggest that we're now in a new Cold War. I imagine you agree with this, but I want to get your thoughts on that language and whether or not it's appropriate and why.
Alex, in a way, it's a hot war, at least as far as the Chinese are concerned, and specifically in certain warfighting domains, a number of which we really haven't thought of as areas of combat. We've talked recently a lot about economic and financial warfare that the Chinese Communist Party has been waging against this country for decades. And this is pretty hot, Alex. I mean, they have been able to secure, without firing a shot, to be certain, up to perhaps as much as $3 trillion from our capital markets, which has gone into funding activities that have enabled the various other threats that we're facing, including some that are directly intended to enable them to have hot war kinetic options as well. There's the information warfare domain, their propaganda, their endless efforts to turn people around the world, not only their own people, but others around the world against this country. There's their influence operations inside the United States itself. There's their technology and intellectual property theft operations, their espionage, and so on. I mean, all of this is really at a wartime fever pitch, I would argue. It's just we haven't recognized it as such. And it hasn't been combined, fortunately, at least to this point, with those, very, very ominous military capabilities being brought to bear so far. But they are now increasingly in play in places like the South China Sea. They've been threatening our vessels. Our aircraft have been lased. And others, the Philippines, the Vietnamese, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, have found their forces increasingly facing more and more overt hostility and increasing, again, capabilities from the Chinese. And much of everything that I've just described, Alex, has been made possible by our underwriting. So I think what Americans are waking up to, and you're absolutely right, they are, this coronavirus has been like the proverbial mugging by reality that ostensibly has turned liberals into conservatives in other contexts. This has changed an awful lot of Americans from being more or less ignorant of what the Chinese are up to, or at least acquiescent in it, to being very alarmed by it, and properly so.
Yeah, very, very good points. And so where does that leave us exactly? Because you're seeing out of China, you're seeing a very big push to try to continue to consolidate power. They're expanding their Health Silk Road, which is their sort of Belt and Road equivalent, where they're trying to provide global health and global health infrastructure to people around the world. And they're also escalating tensions in certain regions like the South China Sea. And perhaps most interesting, Frank, and this is sort of a new development, there's thousands of Chinese troops flooding the border with India as tensions are mounting in that region. And this is one where I've seen almost no American coverage of it. This is potentially a real hotbed here.
What you've described, and unfortunately it's still a somewhat selective rendering of the problem, Alex, is a China that is very much on the march. And it goes back to what I was just saying. I think whether we choose to ignore it or not, whether we actually have the wit to appreciate what it means for us, as well as our interests and allies around the world, China feels at the moment that it is now capable of asserting its will worldwide. And I think that this is most obvious, as you say, in kind of its immediate region, running from the South China Sea, that so-called second chain of islands out there, all the way to India. But it's also, as Breitbart has been reporting, manifesting itself through this Belt and Road Initiative, or its healthcare counterpart, the Health Silk Road, they're calling it, or the fight to insist that countries like Britain must include Huawei technology, which will be used to spy on Britain and on its alliance relationship with the United States, and exploit the data that it will be able to extract from British people for who knows what purposes, running the gamut from espionage to building out this Health Silk Road. Now, I might just say, Alex, this is a particularly ominous development. A good friend and colleague of mine by the name of David Goldman, who writes for Asia Times, has a new book coming out called You Will Be Assimilated, which is basically about Huawei and what it is up to, but also more generally how it fits into China's long-term designs, among other things, to dominate one of the most lucrative of big data target sets, namely healthcare information of people all over the world. And they've exploited this coronavirus, the Chinese Communist Party virus, I call it, that they've unleashed on us, to try to get their hooks into more and more and more of those populations' data. Again, truly worldwide. And what they intend to do with it, according to David, is really to exploit it, not only for medical breakthroughs and enhancing their influence over the medical treatment of people around the world, but also for various other purposes. And let me just give you one example of how this works, Alex, because it's chilling and it's such an insight into the character of this Chinese Communist Party. There's something we've talked about many times, and I know you have with others, called the social credit system that the Chinese have put in place inside China itself, and they're now exporting it elsewhere. And what this basically does is it combines things like facial recognition and gait recognition and artificial intelligence and data mining and quantum computing and massive surveillance cameras and otherwise, to give them sort of real-time insights into who everybody is and where they are and what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're buying, where they're traveling, and so on. Now, what this does when it's tied into this sort of healthcare regimen is it gives them insights into things like the blood type and the tissue types and the DNA of individuals, and what that is now feeding into on an industrial scale in communist China is something that's called organ harvesting, but I don't think that's really an apt way to describe it. It's organ genocide, because they're going in and on demand. They're killing people to take their organs. Sometimes they're transplanting the organs from live persons, in the process killing them. But this is the sort of thing that you can't really quite get your head around, but it's evidence of what we're up against in the Chinese Communist Party, evil on an unimaginable scale, unprecedented scale, I would argue, and it's headed our way. Not just oppressing its own people, not just threatening others around the world, but I believe very much ours here at home as well.
Very interesting from Frank Gaffney. And Frank, it's interesting because I was tracking, as always, we've been really, every day we read Chinese media at Breitbart, which puts us at a huge advantage, and everyone else is too lazy to do it. And you start, I always refer to their rhetoric, but then now you've got China netizens or citizens of the internet referring to saying that Americans are eating the coronavirus dead. Like, literally, this is in the South China Morning Post reporting this at a page on WeChat, a Chinese social media site, saying that Americans are actually processing dead bodies and eating them. And in burgers, by the way, we're making human burgers of coronavirus victims. Sounds like a good way to spread the virus, but that's just me. And they report this stuff, and I don't know how seriously it's taken, but it's just the latest example of very intense rhetoric coming out of a controlled environment that doesn't have free speech and does think of themselves in some degree of major conflict with us. And I just think we all think of this as too much of a trifle. I don't think there's enough people who are taking it seriously. They think China is some sort of a curiosity and that they're more dependent on us than we are on them. And I don't come close to seeing it that way, Frank.
No, you shouldn't. And it's to your credit, Alex, that you're providing this service of actually reporting on what the Chinese communists are telling their own people, because it's instructive, isn't it, as well as ominous in the extreme. What they're telling their own people is the Americans are barbarians. They are enemies. They are engaged in heinous crimes against humanity. All of this helps foster, especially as you say, Alex, in a society in which there isn't really much in the way of alternative sources of information. They've built what's called the Great Chinese Firewall to try to ensure that only what the party wants their people to see and hear and understand is available to them. And, we should talk before we turn off this conversation about Hong Kong and what they're doing there. But one of the things that we have to be about, whether it's in the context of a response to Hong Kong and the crackdown that the Chinese are engaged in there, or whether it's just more broadly what we have to be doing in the face of this kind of increasingly hostile rhetoric as well as behavior, is to get through that firewall, to make sure that the Chinese people are hearing the truth about what's going on in this country and elsewhere around the world, and they're not simply operating on the basis of what they're being told by the party. And the trouble is, Alex, and it's hard for us to get our heads around this, I think. We're so accustomed to, even despite all the shortcomings of our media, having an opportunity to sample a lot of things, including Breitbart, for heaven's sakes. But we're now dealing with 1.x, whatever it is, 4 billion people whose daily fare is essentially nothing but what the party wants them to know about how terrible we are. And that conduces inevitably, especially in a society where that social credit system is rewarding you if you stick with the party line and punishes you if you don't. It's creating, I'm afraid, an appetite for conflict that we, again, are very, very much on notice. We ignore at our peril.
Yeah, certainly that's the case. Frank, let's continue on Hong Kong, because this is where you're seeing now China really cracking down on Hong Kong with the world distracted because of the pandemic. Talk to us about how China's not letting a crisis go to waste here.
Well, arguably the single most important effect from the Chinese Communist Party's point of view of the pandemic that I believe Tom Cotton's is right, they deliberately, consciously, and malevolently unleashed on the world, was taking down the demonstrations in Hong Kong. They tried everything else. They tried threats, they tried coercion, they tried, violence, for everything from, fire hose sprays to, batons to people being scarfed up and disappeared. These were the sorts of things that proved unavailing in the face of the determination, the incredibly courageous determination of the people of Hong Kong to stand for their freedom. And Alex, I think we've talked about this in the past. The reason they've done so courageously is they understand this is the end. If they don't, it's gone forever. They will be just another part of an enslaved population of China. So even today, relatively small numbers are braving all of the restrictions and the threats of arrest and the rest to get out in the streets, and more is likely to come. But that's why the Chinese are moving with alacrity. You're right, most of the rest of us are distracted or hunkered down or have our ships, in ports because of the virus and so on. But they are moving inexorably now with a national security law that will, from here forward, ensure that nobody crosses the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong. certainly without doing so at their extreme peril. And this gets us to the larger point. We need to stand with the people of Hong Kong much more persuasively than we have to date. There are bills that are now in the works in Congress. I'm hoping that they will be very tough. But we really need to signal. It's not enough, just by the way, to say to the Chinese, you're not going to have the most favored nation status sort of cutout that they've enjoyed sending their stuff through Hong Kong because they've pretended to give it sort of autonomy. That's going to come to an end, I'm sure. But the larger question is, are there other things that really cost them dearly? And let me just give you one example, if I may, very quickly, Alex. We've talked about this before. This access to our capital markets, through which they are funding so much of this malevolence, can be snuffed substantially on 30 days' notice by simply rescinding a memorandum of understanding that Joe Biden helped engineer when he was vice president of the United States back in 2013. They have the ability to raise money in our capital markets without having to conform to our rules. If we get rid of that memorandum of understanding, it immediately would start imposing upon them the same sort of accountability and transparency and material risk disclosure that our companies have to engage in. That would get, I believe, their attention, and who knows, it might just help dissuade them from doing what I think they otherwise will do to the people of Hong Kong.
Okay, so Frank Gaffney again is with me, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. Frank, I've got a bunch more topics, so let's go quickly if we can. First of all, your prescription, what should we do to, at a minimum, raise awareness, if not, try to do something to help the people in Hong Kong right now?
Well, again, I think we need to stop the various sweetheart deals that we've done with the Chinese. We need to also make it clear that we're going to be standing not just with the people of Hong Kong, but also with the people of Taiwan, because the Chinese are increasingly signaling that they're going for Taiwan next. So all of these things are, I believe, now going to require a combination of engagement on all of those battle spaces that I talked about at the beginning, Alex, whether it's the economic and financial piece of it, whether it's the information piece, whether it's countering their influence operations and engaging in our own, whether it's asymmetric operations that we can use, some of them covertly, or most especially that we are putting into place our military capabilities to signal that we are not going to allow our allies, our interests in that part of the world to be attacked by the Chinese, who think at the moment we're too distracted or we're too disorganized or irresolute to take all of this seriously. It has to be a comprehensive approach, a whole of society approach by the United States, because fundamentally we are at war. Whether we call it that or not, whether we, again, acknowledge it or not, it may not be as hot as it could well get soon, but we are at war, make no mistake about it, because the Chinese Communist Party has been waging it against us for decades.
So the United Kingdom, which was very far along towards a deal where they were going to be using Huawei for their 5G, which is the China state sanctioned company, and a part of it is because I think a lot of the world is going to drop the ball and let China surpass them in some technology, which is a big problem here, and we need to get on the ball on that in the United States. But UK was going to cut a deal with China, who does predatory mercantilism, always gives out at cut rates, try to get people dependent on them, et cetera. Frank and I have talked about this every week, basically, for feels like forever. But the UK now kind of rolling back that possibility, perhaps even deciding to expel Huawei from its 5G network. This is a pretty big and bold development from not a particularly bold guy, Boris Johnson, and China none too happy about it. What are the details here we need to know, Frank?
The most critical thing is, what does a 5G system in the hands of Huawei and therefore the Chinese Communist Party mean for a free country? It means that your private information, your personal data, becomes part of the social credit system of China. It means that they've expropriated it without your permission, and they will be able to use it perhaps against you without your knowledge, maybe even. Excuse me, Alex. But one of the things that I think is particularly alarming about this is 5G systems are now going to be fueling something called the Internet of Things. I'm sorry. Early morning grogginess. The Internet of Things is something that's being built into all of our appliances. Increasingly, it'll be built into our automobiles, as well as our wireless communication systems. What the control of the 5G system means is that it enables you, when you have all of that information through channeling through your comms, your communication systems, you are able actually not just to monitor what's being done by all of those devices and what decisions the owner is making and so on. You can actually control them. So just think about this. If one were willing and determined to wage war against a society like, let's say, Britain's, for example, and it has over time become hooked up to the wireless system of the Chinese Communist Party, they can weaponize that. For example, automated vehicles can be driven into, obstacles, killing the drivers or the people that would be passengers in that case, actually. They can control the grids, shutting them down at will, costing millions of lives. There are all sorts of things, in other words, that cause you, quite apart from the fact that it would interfere with our alliance relationship with the United Kingdom, if we can't trust their ability to handle classified information because the Chinese are listening in on it all. These are the sorts of things that it's really regrettable that Boris Johnson didn't make this decision at the outset when we were strongly encouraging him to do so. But if he does it now, and I think he will, it's a good thing, and the Chinese are hopping mad about it, which, again, is evidence that it's a good thing for us to be doing.
Frank Gaffney, last one for today. Prime Minister Netanyahu is on trial in Israel for basically trying to get good media coverage and silence bad media coverage, something that every world leader does all over the world all the time, and yet he's on trial for it. Is there anything we need to know beyond that, or is this just a sort of an unfortunate thing that we observe from afar?
Well, it's a complicated situation in the sense that the judiciary of Israel, and I could include the prosecutors in this sort of general description, have been weaponized. They are part of the hard left of Israel. And the hard left of Israel makes the hard left of the United States pale by comparison most days. The hard left of Israel has been using these weapons against Bibi Netanyahu for decades, basically. He's nonetheless managed to be the most successful prime minister in the history of the country, as well as the longest serving one. And it's terrible to watch this play out, Alex. I don't know that he will survive this current assault. They may be trumped up charges, but it doesn't take much to knock him out if they are successful in pursuing him.
Do we have any sense of how it's going so far?
I think it's too early to say. I think the fact that they're in the trial now is a bad sign. He had staved that off for quite some time. He got, fortunately, an agreement with Benny Gantz, the opposition leader, to forge at long last a unity government, and so that is now in place, and hopefully that will be able to govern the country despite all of these distractions. But we've seen what happens when leaders are subjected to this kind of political warfare, using the instruments of the state, as Donald Trump has been subjected to for this country. It can be very, very disorienting, to say the least, if not disabling, of good governance. And Israel can't afford to do that at a time when it's surrounded, as ever, by hostile powers that would like to see its destruction.
Frank, thanks for the terrific reporting. You can go to presentdangerchina.org, counterjihad.com also, and presentdangerchina.org is the one I would go to first. Securefreedom.org as well for a Secure Freedom Minute and Secure Freedom Radio. Thanks, Frank. We'll talk to you next week.